A reading from A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini will be read on my e-text version, pages 53 and 54. All during the ride, as she bounced in the back seat, she cried. They were tears of grief, of anger, of disillusionment, but mainly tears of a deep, deep shame at how foolishly she had given herself over to Jalil, her father, how she had fretted over what dress to wear, over the mismatching hijab, walking all the way there, refusing to leave, sleeping on the street like a stray dog. And she was ashamed of how she had dismissed her mother's stricken looks, her puffy eyes, Nana, who had warned her, who had been right all along. Miriam kept thinking of his face in the upstairs window. He let her sleep on the street, on the street. What would she say to Nana, Miriam wondered. How would she apologize? How could she even face Nana now? The car stopped and the driver helped her out. I'll walk you, he said. She let him guide her across the road and up the track. There was honeysuckle growing along the path, and milkweed too. Then he let her go, and he was talking about how Herat's famous 120-day winds would start blowing out soon, and how the sandflies would go on a feeding frenzy, and then suddenly he was standing in front of her, trying to cover her eyes, pushing her back the way they had came, and saying, "Go back, no, don't look now, turn around, go back." But he wasn't fast enough, and Miriam saw. A gust of wind blew and parted the drooping branches of the weeping willow like a curtain, and Miriam caught a glimpse of what was beneath the tree. The straight-backed chair overturned, the rope dropping from a high branch, Nana dangling at the end of it. A Thousand Splendid Suns spans between the 1960s and the 2000s in Afghanistan during the Afghani War, and follows a couple different characters, one of them being Miriam, who was born out of wedlock and forced to live outside of Herat with her mother, who commits suicide while Miriam is still quite young because her mother is very untrusting of the world that she considers very cruel. And so Miriam is forced to live with her father Jalil, who sells her off to a much older man named Rashid. And Rashid just wants to marry Miriam so that she can have his sons. And so Miriam is put in a very physically and mentally abusive home life, especially when she's unable to bear the sons that Rashid wants, and put in a much conservative household, forcing her to stay inside, be a perfect wife, cook and clean, and cover her skin. And at the same time, we follow the life of a girl named Layla, who lives on the same street as Miriam and Rashid, but is a couple decades younger than Miriam. And while she has a more stable house life, there is still trauma. As her brothers are both sent into the Afghani war and are killed, her mother goes into complete isolation and forces Layla to take on a lot of the motherly duties. And while Layla grows up in a more liberal household than Rashid's, because her Bobby of her father, she feels as if education is something that a woman can have. But that whole life is cut very short when they are eventually forced to flee to Pakistan. But on the way to Pakistan, both of her parents are killed in crossfire, in bombs, and her best friend / love interest, Tariq, also is forced to flee to Pakistan after Layla finds out that she's carrying his child, and is told that Tariq eventually does not make it to Pakistan and dies in the war as well. And so Rashid and Miriam find Layla and nurse her back to health, and Rashid marries Layla in hopes that she can produce him a child, a son, and she does. And they both live, her and Miriam live in this household, this abusive household, with both of Layla's children. And at first, Miriam is very upset that this younger woman is able to do the things that she was never able to do, and that Rashid loves her much more. But eventually, both women want to escape, and to do that, Miriam murders Rashid and to give Layla a life with Tariq, who eventually turns up not dead. And so Miriam must murder Rashid and turns herself into the Taliban, who executes her, and Layla and Tariq are able to live a normal life. To pair with this YA novel, I thought a good canon text would be The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, which follows the nonfiction events between 1942 and 1944 in Amsterdam of Anne Frank, who is a Jewish young girl. She's between the ages of 13 to 15. And as the Nazis begin to occupy and take over the Netherlands, she and her family and a couple others are forced to hide in a small space above her father's office. And this is a diary that was never meant to be published, and so throughout the diary she begins talking a lot about very trivial things like school and crushes, and then as it progresses she talks more about identity and isolation and the unfairness of discrimination and how she can be considered a German while those are the same people that are trying to get rid of her. And she talks a lot about a lot of different things about family struggles and a lot of conflict, and it shows the maturity that she gains throughout these couple of years in the annex. And eventually the diary stops abruptly, and we know that the Franks they were eventually found out, and they were all sent to concentration camps where they all died except her father Otto. While these two novels may seem very different, we see a lot of similarities, especially through their similar themes, one being growing up and maturity. We see that a lot through A Thousand Splendid Suns with both Miriam and Layla in their marriages to Rashid. We see that Rashid forces them to be adult women, to be adult wives at very young ages, and they are not able to be the children that they're supposed to be at that age. We also see that in their life prior to Rashid. Miriam has two very dysfunctional parents, never really knows how to be a child, has to be an adult all of her life, as well as Layla. When her mother goes into isolation, she's forced to take on a lot of her mother's duties and be very mature. We see this in Anne as well, as she is forced, her ideas change from very trivial and boy crushes to identity and the unfairness of discrimination and who she really is in the world. Another theme is war. We see it through the Afghani War in Thousand Splendid Suns and World War II / Nazi occupation in Anne Frank's diary, and we see how war is an outside factor that affects all three of these characters, and it's something that they cannot control. Another theme is isolation. We see it through the physical isolation that Rashid places Miriam and Layla under, as well as the isolation that the Nazis force Anne under, as well as a kind of mental isolation where Miriam feels very alone in a world that she cannot connect to her mother or her father with, and Layla cannot connect to her mother as well as Anne not being able to connect to her mother or her sister, feeling very isolated from them as they're very distant. Another theme is love and loss, and we see this through the love of her mother and losing her mother for Miriam, as well as losing that disillusioned love that she has for Jalil. Layla losing Tariq, her love, for a bit, as well as losing her father Bobby that she loves so much. We also see the love and loss for Anne in Peter that she loves and then realizes that she cannot be with, as well as the love and loss of her family from before the war until after the war when she's in the annex and finds that they're very distant now. And so while these two novels span different time periods and their different locations can seem very different, the themes can connect them and make them very similar.